One of the most comforting illusions of modern societies is this: that civilization is permanent, that once a society becomes educated, wealthy, and democratic, it will naturally remain stable, rational, and humane. That progress is a one-way street. That history moves forward, never backward. But history tells a very different story. Civilization is not a destination, it is a fragile agreement. An agreement between millions of individuals to restrain their impulses, to delay gratification, to accept rules even when no one is watching. This agreement is not genetic, it is not automatic, it is learned. Every generation must be taught, again and again, that violence is not a solution, that frustration is not entitlement, that disagreement does not justify destruction. When that teaching weakens, civilization does not collapse overnight. It erodes, slowly, quietly, politely. At first, norms soften, standards lower, excuses multiply. Bad behavior is rebranded as self-expression. Irresponsibility is reframed as authenticity. Discipline is mocked as oppression. Institutions continue to exist, but the values that once gave them meaning fade. The laws remain. The buildings stand. The symbols are still there, but the internal restraints are gone. Modern societies assume wealth will civilize people, that education will produce wisdom, that rights will automatically create responsibility. They don't. Wealth without discipline produces entitlement. Education without moral grounding produces justification. Rights without duty produce chaos. Civilization does not fail because people become poorer. It fails because people forget why restraint mattered in the first place. And when norms dissolve, force quietly returns. Not always as armies or revolutions, but as daily aggression, public disorder, social intimidation, and the normalization of disrespect. This is why civilized behavior collapses fastest in environments where consequences disappear. When shame is abolished, when standards are labeled judgmental, when every boundary is framed as discrimination. What replaces civilization is not freedom. It is regression, a return to impulse, a return to dominance, a return to the rule of the loud, the aggressive, the unrestrained. This video is not about race, not about religion, not about identity. Those are distractions. This video is about culture, about norms, about behavior, about what happens when a society stops transmitting its civilizational software and assumes the system will keep running on its own. It won't. Civilization must be actively maintained, enforced socially, reinforced culturally, defended unapologetically. Because the uncomfortable truth is this: barbarism is not the exception in human history, it is the default, and civilization exists only where people choose, every day, to rise above it. In the 20th century, sociologist Norbert Elias introduced one of the most unsettling ideas in modern social theory in the civilizing process. Human beings are not naturally civilized, they are naturally impulsive. Civilization is not the absence of violence, but the constant suppression of it. It is the long historical process by which raw instincts are pushed inward, where aggression is delayed, desire is regulated, and impulse is filtered through social expectation. Modern societies function not because force is always present, but because it is usually unnecessary. Individuals obey rules even when no police officer is watching. They control anger even when violence would be easier. They restrain themselves even when they could get away with not doing so. Why? Because authority no longer lives only in the state. It lives inside the individual. Shame, guilt, conscience, and social expectation become internal governors of behavior. This is the true achievement of civilization, the migration of control from external force to internal restraint. The state does not need to threaten violence at every moment because most people already threaten themselves. They anticipate consequences. They fear social exclusion. They feel embarrassment before punishment is even necessary. But this system is fragile. When self-restraint weakens, the state must compensate. When individuals stop regulating themselves, laws must be enforced more aggressively. Surveillance increases, policing expands, punishment replaces trust, and eventually even that fails. Because laws without internal restraint are nothing more than ink on paper. You can write rules endlessly, but rules do not execute themselves. Civilization collapses not when laws disappear, but when people stop believing they should restrain themselves even when they can do harm. At that point, force returns to the center of social life, not because the state becomes cruel, but because it has no other option. This is the paradox Elias warned about. The more a society loses self-restraint, the more authoritarian it must become just to remain functional. And when self-restraint disappears entirely, no amount of law is enough. For decades, Europe and the United States operated under a single comforting assumption. That proximity would produce harmony. That if people lived in the same cities, used the same infrastructure, attended the same schools, and held the same passports, they would eventually adopt the same values. That time and exposure alone would dissolve differences. This assumption was wrong. Culture does not dissolve by relocation. It does not melt into its surroundings. Culture is portable, and more importantly, culture is reproductive. It transmits itself through family structures, through peer groups, through informal rules, through what is rewarded, tolerated, or punished inside a community. Moving people across borders does not rewrite their internal norms. It merely changes the physical setting in which those norms are expressed. Today, many Western cities contain parallel societies. People share streets, public transportation, legal systems, schools, and welfare institutions. Yet they do not share behavioral expectations. In the same city, one group treats public space as neutral and shared. Another treats it as contested and dominated. One group relies on institutions to resolve conflict. Another relies on social pressure, intimidation, or force. One group internalizes limits. Another tests boundaries until resistance appears. This divide is often misdiagnosed. It is not biological. It is not racial. It is not ethnic. Those explanations are intellectually lazy and morally evasive. The difference is behavioral. It lies in what is considered acceptable conduct, in how authority is perceived, in whether rules are internalized or merely navigated around. When societies assume values will converge automatically, they stop insisting on standards. And when standards are no longer enforced culturally, they must be enforced coercively. Integration fails not because people are different, but because societies lose the confidence to demand behavioral alignment. Without shared norms, diversity does not become richness. It becomes fragmentation, not overnight, but steadily, silently, until the illusion of shared values collapses under daily reality. Ghettoization is not merely an economic condition. It is not just unemployment, housing density, or low income. It is psychological separation, a withdrawal from the moral framework of the surrounding society and the construction of an alternative one. In some neighborhoods, rules are not neutral safeguards. They are perceived as tools of domination. Following rules is interpreted as weakness. Compliance signals submission. Self-restraint is mocked. Violence, by contrast, signals strength. Reputation replaces law. Fear becomes social currency. The state is not seen as a legitimate authority, but as an external force, distant, selective, and adversarial. Interaction with institutions becomes transactional. Welfare without loyalty. Rights without obligation, services without identification. Victimhood, in this environment, is not merely a condition, it is leverage. Moral immunity is claimed through grievance, and responsibility is deflected through historical blame. In other neighborhoods, the logic is inverted. Rules are not oppression, they are protection. Violence is not power, it is failure, a sign that social mechanisms have broken down. The state is not an enemy, but a guarantor of predictability, allowing strangers to coexist without constant negotiation or threat. Trust replaces intimidation. Institutions replace honor. Delayed gratification replaces impulse. These groups often live meters apart. They share streets, schools, transit systems, and passports. But they do not share a civilizational operating system. They inhabit the same city, but not the same civilization. This pattern is not theoretical. It is observable. It is visible in the banlieues of France, where the state recedes block by block, in the so-called no-go zones of Sweden, where parallel norms replace national ones, in the emergence of parallel societies in Germany, where integration is measured administratively but fragmentation persists culturally. In the knife crime statistics of United Kingdom, where violence becomes normalized among youth long before adulthood arrives, and in the inner cities of the United States, where cycles of aggression survive decades of spending, reform, and rhetoric. The common thread is not race, not ethnicity, not biology. It is the collapse of shared behavioral norms and the retreat of internal restraint. When mental separation hardens, physical separation follows. And when societies refuse to name this process, they lose the ability to stop it. Modern discourse prefers a comforting explanation for crime, that it is purely an individual choice, a matter of personal morality, a failure of character, a bad decision made in isolation. This framing is reassuring because it preserves the illusion that society itself remains intact. But some behaviors cannot be understood at the individual level. They are learned long before choice is possible. If a child grows up in an environment where rule breakers are rewarded, violence earns respect, authority is viewed as illegitimate, and victimhood provides moral advantage, that child does not later decide to become a different kind of adult. They simply mature into the logic they were taught. This is not a moral failure. It is not a defect of intelligence. It is not even necessarily malice. It is cultural transmission. Values are not absorbed through textbooks. They are absorbed through observation, through what goes unpunished, through who gains status, through which behaviors are admired, tolerated, or feared. In such environments, restraint is irrational, compliance is naive, peace is temporary. Crime does not feel transgressive because it is not experienced as deviance. It is experienced as normal behavior within a coherent moral framework. When a society treats these patterns as a collection of unrelated individual failures, it blinds itself to the real mechanism at work. Punishment alone cannot fix a norm. Welfare cannot overwrite a value system. Policing cannot substitute for internal restraint. In these environments, crime is not an exception to the rule, it is the rule. And until societies acknowledge that norms reproduce themselves, they will continue to fight symptoms while the culture that generates them remains untouched. Another deeply rooted Western misconception is this: that assistance automatically produces integration. That material support will eventually translate into social alignment. That time, funding, and goodwill are enough. They are not. Assistance without expectation does not integrate. It stabilizes separation. When aid is detached from responsibility, when benefits are granted without reciprocal obligation, victimhood stops being a temporary condition. It becomes an identity, and identities, once institutionalized, begin to generate incentives. Over time, victimhood evolves into an economy sustained by grants, by NGOs, by advocacy networks, by academic careers, by policy frameworks, by conferences, reports, and advisory boards. Entire professional ecosystems emerge whose legitimacy depends on the persistence of the problem. The narrative must be maintained. The crisis must never fully resolve. The language must remain urgent but vague. Because solutions are dangerous. Solutions end funding. They close departments. They dissolve relevance. Problems, by contrast, are productive. They justify budgets. They sustain careers. They legitimize authority. As a result, failure becomes normalized. Lack of progress is reframed as complexity. Worsening outcomes are explained as underfunding. The system is not designed to solve the issue. It is designed to manage it indefinitely. Meanwhile, the communities in question receive a clear message. You are entitled to support, but not expected to change. Responsibility is externalized. Agency is removed. Behavior is excused rather than confronted. Integration stalls, not because resources are insufficient, but because incentives are misaligned. A society cannot integrate people while rewarding the permanence of separation. And until responsibility is reattached to assistance, aid will continue to treat symptoms while quietly financing the conditions that reproduce them. At a certain point, the West lost the ability to speak plainly, not because problems disappeared, but because naming them became forbidden. Issues could be observed, measured, mapped, but not described honestly. Language itself became dangerous. Description was recast as offense. Analysis was reframed as exclusion. Pattern recognition was dismissed as prejudice. Silence was rebranded as virtue. As a result, societies learned to look away while continuing to see everything. But unspoken problems do not remain neutral. They compound. When problems cannot be named, they cannot be prioritized. When they cannot be prioritized, they cannot be confronted. Policy replaces diagnosis. Slogans replace strategy. Moral signaling replaces enforcement. This silence created space for ghettos to solidify, for parallel societies to mature without scrutiny, for alternative norms to harden beyond negotiation. Without public language to describe deviation, standards quietly dissolve. What was once unacceptable becomes tolerated. What was tolerated becomes normal. What was normal becomes defended. Norms erode not through rebellion, but through hesitation. Not through revolution, but through avoidance. The inability to speak honestly does not produce harmony. It produces fragmentation. Because reality does not disappear when it becomes unspeakable. It reorganizes itself outside the language of the society that refuses to confront it. And by the time the silence breaks, the cost of speaking is far higher than it ever would have been at the start. America encountered this collapse earlier than Europe, not because it was uniquely flawed, but because it reached the limits of tolerance sooner. In its inner cities, state authority gradually weakened, not formally, but functionally. The laws remained on paper, the courts remained open, the police remained present. Yet norms disintegrated, rules were no longer internalized, boundaries were tested relentlessly, order became conditional. Violence did not erupt suddenly, it normalized. It became routine, predictable, embedded into daily life. The response was administrative, more policing, longer sentences, expanded prisons. The state grew heavier, but civilization did not grow stronger, because civilization is not built by law alone. Law can punish behavior, but it cannot create restraint. Law can suppress chaos temporarily, but it cannot generate shared norms. In the absence of internal discipline, external force must increase endlessly, and yet it never catches up. America built one of the largest prison systems in history, not because it lacked compassion, but because it lacked cultural transmission. The mistake was assuming that enforcement could substitute for behavior. That order could be imposed without being internalized. Europe watched this unfold as if it were a distant anomaly, a uniquely American problem, a byproduct of race, history, or inequality. It was not. It was a preview, a demonstration of what happens when norms collapse faster than institutions can compensate. Because when self-restraint disappears, the state can expand indefinitely and still fail. Civilization does not scale through punishment. It survives only where behavior aligns with rules before force becomes necessary. And once that alignment is lost, no prison system is large enough to restore it. Integration is not a right, it is a process. And every process has conditions. It requires time, it requires pressure, it requires reciprocity. Most importantly, it requires mutual transformation. Newcomers must adapt to the norms of the society they enter, but the society itself must remain confident enough to insist on those norms. When a society abandons its own standards in the name of tolerance, it does not create inclusion. It creates ambiguity. Rules become negotiable, boundaries become optional, expectations disappear, and where expectations vanish, no integration can occur. A society that refuses to define itself cannot ask others to join it. What follows is not harmony, but dissolution. Shared values fragment, behavioral baselines collapse, public space loses neutrality. The result is not diversity, but coexistence without cohesion. This failure is often misdiagnosed. It is not biology, it is not ethnicity, it is not destiny, it is psychology, it is sociology. It is the predictable outcome of norm abandonment and incentive misalignment. Integration succeeds only where a society believes its way of life is worth transmitting. When that belief is lost, integration becomes impossible. Not because people refuse to change, but because there is nothing left to integrate into. And a civilization that cannot reproduce its norms will not be replaced by something better. It will simply fade. Civilizations do not collapse in dramatic moments, not through war, not through crisis, not through revolution. They collapse through small acceptances, through every quiet, "this is normal now," through every patient, "we will get used to it," through every hesitant, "let's not interfere." No single decision ends a civilization. Thousands of unchallenged behaviors do. Because civilization is not concrete, not steel, not constitutions or laws. It is a behavioral contract, an unspoken agreement that certain actions will be restrained, certain limits will be respected, certain lines will not be crossed, even when crossing them is possible. That contract is not permanent. It must be renewed every day. Through expectation, through enforcement, through social consequence. When it is not renewed, it does not shatter, it decays. Silently, incrementally, without announcement. The institutions remain, the language survives, the symbols persist, but something essential is gone, and everyone feels it. That something is no longer the same. This video did not give you answers. It reminded you of something more important. That some questions, when left unasked, do not offend. They end societies.